This is update for June 14, 2022, day 111 of the war, end of the date update. So we're gonna do a little bit of strategic discussion, and then we're gonna go through the front line. So yesterday I actually forgot to discuss one thing that I mentioned, and then I didn't get to it, was how fertilizers and energy and food are all related topic. So for that, let's actually go back and figure out how the population of this planet is able to feed itself. So there was a significant change in the 50s and early 60s when humans were able to figure out how to cheaply produce nitrogen fertilizer. And nitrogen fertilizers is the key for the growth of crops, right? For all of these grains and stuff. There are three key fertilizers. It stands for NPK. Nitrogen, phosphorus, and then K stands for potash in English, which is not consistent with the periodic system of elements where it's K, and let's say in Ukrainian it's Kali. But in any case, out of these three, nitrogen is the most important. And what happened in the, let's say, 50s, there was so-called Green Revolution, it's completely wrong name. It's a chemical revolution where there were set up large plants that were using natural gas, and then they would convert that natural gas into nitrogen fertilizer. And then when you apply nitrogen fertilizer, it increases yields, crop yields significantly. Let's say, and it really depends also on the soil, right? So it's not just fertilizer, it's interplay of the two. So like if it's a poor soil, then you need more of it, right? If it's high quality fertile soil, like for example in Ukraine, parts of Russia, as far as I know, some parts of Brazil and elsewhere, then you need less of it, right? So you rely less. But in anyways, essentially everywhere around the world, farmers use quite extensively this nitrogen fertilizer, and so what happens is, since Russia has a huge deposit of natural gas. It's more so rich in natural gas than crude oil. It essentially, what it did, it set up a lot of plants during Soviet time, actually, to convert natural gas to fertilizers. And some of those plants were actually in Ukraine. So like that's where Severodonetsk is. There was one plant. Then in Ukraine, there's another one in Odessa. Then there is a big one in Cherkasy, and then one more here near Rivne. So there were a lot of those really huge plants that were producing this nitrogen fertilizer for the Soviet Union, and then it was exported around the world. And it was very extremely competitive because their natural gas was really cheap, right? So this way, Russia essentially controls about like 30 to 40% of nitrogen fertilizer market in the world through different companies. So when you have less of that fertilizer, then your yields go down significantly. And the more poor soil is, the more yields go down, the more you dependent on that. So for example, countries with relatively poor soil would be like Germany. Well, I'm not sure about England, probably England. So like I think Baltic states, like Poland, they don't have the highest quality soil, right? And so they need more of it. And so this situation, when the natural gas goes through the roof, it also increases price of the fertilizer to the point that it's not cost effective for farmers to use it, right? So what they do, they reduce, application of fertilizer, yields go down, the food prices go up, right? That's how it works. And so this is how it's this whole system in very interrelated. And you can see that there are many places around the world where there's less fertilizer being applied, so it globally reduces yields and globally reduces production of their sort of staple of grain foods, right? So, for example, there are news in Pakistan that now, because a lot of so the Pakistan was also producing nitrogen fertilizer from natural gases. Everybody does that, right? So they don't have their own natural gas. They would buy it on their international market and get supplies through LNG. So now, because the price of natural gas is so high in Europe, so all of the LNG is getting diverted to Europe, and so Pakistan does not get, natural gas. They cannot produce fertilizer. Yields go down. They cannot even generate enough energy in the country. So there is like blackouts throughout the country. So that's kind of like how this whole kind of like dominoes kind of fall one after another. So this hopefully helps to understand how this whole situation is also affected, how the basically global sort of situation is affected by not so much by this war, but this whole thing that's been going on for past couple of years. So that's one point. And then I would like to clarify another point about interest rates. When I was referring to interest rates, I was referring to the interest rate that is set by Federal Reserve in the US, because those interest rates essentially drive interest rates around the world. So in a way, you can kind of say that Federal Reserve is sort of central bank of the world that drives, to a great extent, not completely, but to a great extent, economic policies of the other countries around the world. So if it increases the interest rates, that will affect the rest of the world, and especially the more sort of interconnected systems such as Europe, Japan, UK, and China, and Russia will be affected as well. And the reason, the way it works, what I meant is that when the key interest rate that's right now is sort of the driving everything is a yield on a 10-year treasury US, right? It's a government debt, 10-year notes, right? So what we can see is that the yield, or interest rates in other words, is going up pretty quickly. And even when it goes up pretty quickly, it was yesterday, and then today actually was another jump, right? It destroys the sort of equity market, right? Stock market, destroys many other things, right? But what it does not destroy for sure is, you can see that when you look at their commodities exchanges, at what price crude oil trades, it's still stubbornly stuck at about $120 per barrel, right? So this increase in interest rates, and the typical way it works is increase in interest rate will usually crash commodities, right? That's how it usually works. They are kind of like polar opposites, right? Interests go up, then the prices for commodities go down, and then when interests are low, then the prices for commodities kind of go up. So this is kind of more or less the dynamic. It's not always perfect, but as a big picture, that's how it works. And so what is very concerning and what is very bad is that because of supply of crude oil is so constrained around the world, this increase in interest rates that's happening in the US is not enough to essentially bring the price of crude oil and other commodities down, but specifically crude oil down, which really means that interest rates needs to go much higher to destroy consumer demand in the West to bring crude oil prices down. And so this is what Federal Reserve essentially is probably going to do on Wednesday, when they will increase high interest rates, 50 basis points, 75, 100, whatever they will do. but what it does, it puts huge brakes on the economies in developing world, and with the US first of all, but it will affect everything. It will affect EU very much, so probably will affect Japan, UK. So everybody's going to get affected in the end. Just things, sooner or later, everybody will feel the pain. It's just a question of how quickly you're going to get it, right? So this is what I was trying to explain, that this is what's going on. And the problem why this does not work so well as it used to be, when you increase simply interest rates and everything is great and the commodities go down and you can still be okay, is there is another sort of constraint, and the problem is that economies in the West are extremely over leveraged, right? So which means, in simple terms, too much debt, right? When you increase interest rates, that's really bad for over leveraged economies, because there is a lot of bankruptcies as a result, because a lot of people cannot afford to pay higher interest rates, right? So it's kind of like, so this is a very difficult situation in general, economy wise around the world, and this situation with oil make everything is even more difficult, right? So this is what I'm trying to explain. I'm not trying to say, hey, this is Ukraine's fault. It's just definitely not Ukraine's decision to start this war. Ukraine, in a way, is trying to survive in all of this sort of big picture of what's going on in the world, right? So just want to discuss a little bit clarified, because there's a lot of, I think people were thinking, there was quite a bit of misunderstanding in the comment section from the viewers. Then now let's actually go a little bit to the weapon situation in Ukraine and heavy weapons, because there were questions from other viewers. Okay, so what's the situation? Is Ukraine getting anything from the West? Essentially, at this point, supplies of heavy weapons essentially on the pause. There's no new announcements. Ukraine will get 7 Panzerhaubitzer 2000 from Germany on June 22nd, and that's essentially largest, which really tiny amount if you can think about it. But this is their only sort of like a big ticket item that Ukraine still expects, and also the M142 and M270, those multiple rocket launching systems. So that's it. But they are about, I believe, 4 from US, four from the UK, and then Germany kind of like decided not to supply those. So basically, it's just four units. It's definitely not going to change anything, and that's essentially it. And this is a big problem, because Ukrainian leadership starts to realize that like there is no heavy weapons in large quantities are coming anytime soon, and that creates obviously concerns there. And this is what I've been saying from the very beginning, that Ukraine cannot afford to fight this war from a point of abundance of resources. Ukraine needs to be efficient to be able to stand the ground in this war, and this is exactly opposite of what Ukraine is being doing. It was extremely wasteful in resources, and it was behaving as if it's Soviet Union that can throw people and equipment everywhere, just get things destroyed, and there's no problem. And this is what is probably the Ukrainian leadership slowly realizing, hey, we were thinking that, okay, we don't train enough, we don't have great command, okay, we're just going to rely on significant advantage in heavy weapons that we're going to get from the West. And that's kind of really not happening, and so they don't have plan B, basically. And that's a problem, essentially. And there's another problem here, basically related to this. So Ukraine uses a lot of old Soviet artillery system, right? They usually are either 152 millimeters or 122 millimeters. So that was kind of like two main calibers in the Soviet army. And the same, obviously, true for Russia, for Ukraine. It's because the same. They're essentially, old Soviet army, basically. Two smaller Soviet armies, right? So in the Soviet army, 122 was more prevailing caliber, right? Because it's kind of cheaper. And then 152 was sort of in minority, let's put this way, probably in a simple way. So what's happening is, first of all, Ukraine essentially ran out of 152 millimeter ammunition. So essentially, it's almost gone, and there's nobody in the world who produces that. Only Russia does, because everybody else switched to 155 millimeter caliber. So, and this is another problem that Ukrainian government never, took care of, creating plants that produce shells, artillery shells, or anything that's like heavy weapon related. It was totally neglected, and I can use a much more stronger word, but I'll stay diplomatic on this, right? So this is now a problem that Ukraine was got some inventory from the Eastern Europe, probably from Czech Republic, from Poland, from Slovakia, from Bulgaria, from those, but the inventory is depleted. That's it. So so this is kind of one part of the equation. The second part of the equation is the actually artillery barrels, right? And if you look inside, it's called bore. It's rifled, and so after you shoot like enough of artillery shells, that bore inside gets worn out. Basically, the grooves getting destroyed. So essentially, after a certain number of shootings, you need to replace the bore in artillery pieces, right? Which is, in artillery, the barrel is like engine. It's like main thing, right? So the end use for a lot of those systems is coming up, and they need to be replaced. And Ukraine, again, is not producing 152 millimeter shells, does not produce the artillery. Sorry, I'm losing it. Artillery barrels. So this is essentially, it can put out of sort of service in let's say months or two. I don't have exact sort of date, and nobody does, but there's a sort of the end is in sight. And so in a quick fashion, effectively, Ukraine will need to replace quite large number of those artillery pieces, right? And not only replace them, but also get 155 millimeter shells for those, right? So basically, Ukraine, kind of like in the middle of the war, it needs to switch from 152 millimeter artillery to 155 millimeter artillery, from both perspectives, from ammunition point of view and also from the actual guns point of view. So this is even just, if you have everything, it would be extremely difficult, just plain logistically. But the problem is that Ukraine is not even getting those systems to be able to replace, and it does not produce those, and there was no actions put in place to start some kind of production, or at least do something about it in Ukraine. So this is another sort of looming crisis that Ukraine is going to be facing in pretty short order, that needs to be taken into account. So now let's actually, after we discussed all of this, let's now do a walk through the front line in a clockwise fashion, and we're gonna start from the very north as we always do. So again, there is artillery fire, mortar fire exchange across the border, and as I mentioned many times, this is being kept by Russia as opportunity to declare war when it decides to do so. On other sort of topic is actually related to all of this. There was a member of Russian parliament who said openly that Russia is probably will stop recognizing Ukraine, and then I think Latvia and Estonia, and I'm not sure about Lithuania, as independent states, as sovereign states, right? That they will, diplomatically recall that sort of status. And I'm not expert on sort of diplomatic terms, but basically Russia says, okay, they no longer we don't recognize them as sovereign states, as independent states. Therefore, we can do whatever we want with those. So this is obviously how to say, is a sort of testing ball. It's this person didn't speak out of because he decided, woke up and he decided to do so. He was obviously instructed to say that, and this is just to test reaction of international community towards this towards these words. And obviously there are like always consequences behind those words. So this is just kind of gives you another sort of flavor about the whole situation. So, and that's why I keep saying that this is kind of important. What's going on here with the shelling, but this is kind of like open door for some much worse action potentially that could follow. So the intensity remains more or less the same, but you really don't need to raise intensity, right? So you just have enough of the shelling, and you can claim that Ukraine is, killing your own civilians, and that justifies the war. Now let's look what's going on east of Kharkiv. So situation here stabilized after Ukrainian army was pushed a little bit in this area around Starytsya. So this is just a reminder how it all looks. So Russian side managed to kind of create this buffer here in this area. So, and this is sort of no man's land, the forest and gray area here. Otherwise, this is low intensity fighting. It's not sort of large offensive or anything. This is just Russian troops are trying to push Ukrainian troops a little bit further from the state border to protect its critical infrastructure that's close to Ukrainian border. And obviously Ukrainian side tries to do opposite. Now let's actually let's move south. Let's look what's going on at Izyum bridgehead. So this is high-level schematic view of the situation there. Now let's just actually jump here and let's see what's going on. So there was developments in their sort of eastern side of this Izyum bridgehead, where Russian troops managed to initially capture village Bogorodychne. Then Ukrainian side maintained small-scale counterattack, and essentially the fighting is going on in the village. So the fighting is still going on. Russian side does not hold the entire village as of end of the 14th, and the fighting is there. Then here, Russian troops managed to push Ukrainian side literally to the village of Krasnopilya and Dolina, and we can actually look what's going on here. This is essentially like one big village, this Krasnopilya and Dolina, but essentially Ukrainian side now is pushed and defending on the outskirts of these villages, right? So this is Russian push here, and this is approximate line in Bogorodychne. Basically, it's split in half, and the fighting is going on somewhere inside of the village. So now let's go back. There is a lot of sort of Russian propaganda spread that Russian troops captured this peninsula. No, they did not capture this peninsula. They did try to establish bridgeheads, but so far they were not successful there. Now let's continue. Let's look what's going on at Severodonetsk salient, where obviously Severodonetsk is the sort of center of attention right now, because essentially you can say that Ukrainian troops not encircled in a true way, but the logistical situation there is severely damaged. And let's just look what's going on there. As we discussed, there are these two main bridges, and they were destroyed by Russian artillery, right? So this is kind of turning into a situation. There was one viewer who actually said that this is similar to how it was in Stalingrad. Yeah, this does look very similar in terms of that there are no bridges. Ukrainian troops are in the industrial facility here defending, and then the main body of Ukrainian army is on the other side of the river. So yeah, there's a lot of analogies there, and yeah, the sort of conclusion from that sort of logic is that was a extremely bloody battle for both German and Soviet side, where they basically were drained, and this potentially could turn into similar situation, basically, right? Except there is even bigger question if Ukrainian army will be able to successfully supply necessary ammunition here. The sort of on the positive part, there is essentially no heavy equipment here on Ukrainian side, so it's all essentially light infantry. So you don't really need to have a lot of sort of supplies. You obviously just need bullets type of things, grenades, something, some probably anti-tank rockets and stuff like that. So it's nothing. It's not like you need to bring tank there or anything super heavy. So it's technically doable if sort of logistical system works well, which in many instances it doesn't. But we'll see. It's really hard to predict where it's all gonna go from here. So now let's look we're gonna look what's going on here in this area around Popasna salient. So sort of northern part of it. As always, Russian troops heavily attacked in the direction of Berestova here, Bogorodychne, in attempt to obviously create breaks through the Ukrainian defenses and create encirclement. The same goes true for Mykolaiivka. They attacked Vrubivka from two directions, as we discussed, and based on some of unconfirmed information, they managed to let's look at this. They managed to a little bit push Ukrainian defenses towards outskirts of Vrubivka. They didn't capture the Vrubivka, but basically, as you can see, this kind of line, and this is unconfirmed. We still don't have another sort of source that would verify that. But what it looks like that they managed to push Ukrainian side basically towards literally to be on outskirts of Vrubivka, similar how it is in Mykolaiivka, right, where the Ukrainian troops essentially on the outskirts of this village. So this is nothing terribly yet bad in terms of Ukrainian side did not really lose Vrubivka, because otherwise it's really creating very difficult situation for Ukrainian troops here, and essentially will force withdrawal, or they will be essentially encircled. So far it got sort of marginally worse if this information is confirmed, because again it's not totally confirmed information, but the situation is still sort of manageable, but it definitely deteriorated, there is no question, if this is true. Now let's actually look a little bit towards southern sort of section of this whole Popasna area. And here, essentially, Russian troops were pushing from the eastern side. Actually, not only from this salient that was created by the First Army Corps, but also Wagner mercenaries were strongly pushing Ukrainian side here. And let's actually look a little bit more in detail. This is this salient created by the First Army Corps, and Wagner mercenaries are attacking from. They basically responsible for this section of the front line here. So there was strong attack from them from village Vrubivka. towards this tiny hamlet here. It's actually unclear where the sort of front line ended up being. Could be literally on this road. Could be that they even managed to cross the road, but basically this is where Ukrainian front line lies here. And it's not hard to guess if they are attacking towards the small hamlet, and then eventually they could easily sort of turn south, or other First Army Corps will manage to break through. And they're basically trying to replicate their success, how they managed to essentially force to eliminate this Svitlodarsk salient that Ukrainian troops used to control, and they were basically they attacked Ukrainian side from their flank and from the rear, and created threat of encirclement and forced withdrawal of Ukrainian troops from Svitlodarsk in Maryinka without any fight. So they essentially captured this territory without, by actually skillful, executions, skillful thinking, skillful, planning, as opposed to brutal force attack. So they probably trying to replicate something similar in this area right now. Now let's go south. Let's see what's going on west of Donetsk. This is never-ending story of trying to again capture Avdiyivka. This is what Russian troops are trying to do. Again, weak attacks towards New York. Some kind of weak attacks here, and then weak attacks south of the Avdiyivka. But that essentially there's not enough forces on the Russian side to create any kind of progress here. So otherwise there's just artillery shelling in the other sections of the front here. This is just a closer look at this Avdiyivka situation. Now let's look at Zaporizhia front line, where things are as well very stable, very frozen. Just exchange of artillery fire and low-level skirmishes, but nothing really major here. This is how it looks overall, this front line. There was a question in terms of okay, when I said there's no continuous front line, what does this really mean? This really means that both sides try to occupy villages and turn them into strongholds. And there are basically different size of kind of holes between the villages, between the strongholds, right? Because they dig in, create trenches, create sort of not bunkers, but basically with like wooden bunkers, I guess you could say that. And then they just rely on the sort of flanking fire from one stronghold to another one, right? And it's not, and in many instances, it's really, let's say, poorly planned, so there is no good flanking fire. So if you're really aggressive, if you're really good and intelligent, then you can find holes to exploit. And there's obviously tons of opportunity for the reconnaissance team to infiltrate, right, each other's front line. So this is basically this front line is essentially, think about like a Swiss cheese with a lot of holes, right? So if one side is really aggressive, wants to exploit it, and intelligent about it, it's totally doable, right? But I would say neither side is. So the situation is more or less stable. And the reason for this is because neither side has enough troops, right? There's just simply not enough people. And that's why there is this situation. So again, then let's move to the Kherson bridgehead here. And situation the same, positional fighting, everything's kind of frozen, artillery shelling, reconnaissance team infiltrating into each other's sort of near rear, and essentially that's all what it is right now. The situation here on pause, and both sides are obviously focused on situation on Izyum bridgehead and area around Popasna, Severodonetsk. Okay, thanks for watching, and until tomorrow, bye-bye.